the choir in '73, and Frank was then the conductor. I had no idea that he had already clocked up 21 years by the time I joined the choir. And the choir became a focal point for his life for 47 years. From the heady start of over 150 men in the choir, numbers dwindled for various reasons. There were many other opportunities for Christian witness, which were taken by some of the members, and therefore they couldn't continue with the choir and so on. And so the numbers decreased fairly rapidly. And at one stage, I think you wouldn't have needed more than the 10 digits on 2 hands to be able to count the number of choir members. But Frank persevered, because for him, this was a very important part of his witness for the Lord. It was an unique opportunity. One of the accounts I like to tell is of when we visited Parramatta Jail. That was in the days long before mobile phones and so on. And getting into the jails was not that difficult. We sang for the inmates of Parramatta Jail. And the wisecrack I like to make is that it was a captive audience, you see. So, and 2 of the guys there said that they had never heard the gospel message before. And this was Frank's focus. In all the singing, it wasn't the music which was important. I mean, it was important to an extent of, but the focus was the words. He used to say, there's no point in singing the song if the people can't hear the words. And the words were what he used to try and make sure got emphasized at the right time. Margaret Branson, who was the pianist for the choir for a number of years, recalled that Frank used to put a lot of time. It was evident that he used to put a lot of time into thinking through the words of the song, to trying to get the right expression at the right time to convey the right message with the right words. Alex Key is over here, and he was one of the early members of the choir. In fact, from day one, I think. He may feel like saying something about Frank a little bit later on, but I just want to finish with a couple of comments. The male voice choir in Sydney led to a male voice choir being established in Brisbane and also in Melbourne. And I've just got a couple of notes here from men who were associated with those 2 choirs, and I'd like to read them out. From Neil Moss, who is now with the Brisbane Festival Male Voice Choir. Back in 1981, before I had anything to do with the male voice choir, we lived in Sydney for 18 months. We attended the same church as Frank and Daphne and got to know them and their family quite well. Years later, after I joined the Brisbane choir, we travelled by bus to Sydney and stayed with the family before joining with the Sydney choir in a bus trip to Melbourne for a festival. It was quite a trip. And from Ken Harris in the Melbourne Male Voice Praise, I joined the Sydney choir as a 14-year-old in 1957 under Dr. Bruce Stephen and sang with Frank for many years until he became an associate conductor and then lead conductor when Bruce left the choir. There are many memories of good times spent with the Sydney choir before my wife Lucy and I moved to Melbourne. Frank will be sadly missed. His commitment and dedication to his Lord and the choir was exceptional, and he leaves a rich inheritance. I think that says it all.
Thank you, David. I'd just like to read a few verses from the Bible. The first one from John chapter 14, and starting at verse 1. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. And I'd also like to read from Numbers chapter 12, starting from verse 1. And Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. And they said, Hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us? And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very meek, above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. Frank was a frail child, and he grew up to be a gentle and sensitive man. He was not the kind of man to take the limelight, but he was always willing to work in the background for the glory of God. Everyone remembers Frank for his puns. He could tell puns by the hour if people would listen to him, but this rarely happened as his listeners ran out of patience. Jen remembers her father as a hard-working man who worked 5.5 days a week and spent every second Friday going to choir practice. She remembers that he attended the conservatorium as a night student so that he could learn and understand more about music in order to write arrangements for the choir. Gary remembers Frank as a manufacturing jeweller who dealt with precious metals and stones. However, Frank was never rich in worldly goods because he was a compassionate man who cared deeply for people. Dorothy Newman called and said when she heard that Frank had been called home, Frank has a very special place in our hearts. He made my magnificent engagement ring and also the wedding ring to match 46 years ago. He was a true artisan, and I thought immediately of Exodus 31, verses 2 to 5, and that speaks about one of the men who was involved in making the things for the temple. Frank was filled with the Holy Spirit to design and create precious jewellery. Frank loved children. In fact, the last thing I remember him saying to Jenny just 2 days before the Lord called him home was, "Say hi to the kids for me." Gary remembers him teaching Tim manners and always said, "That's my pleasure, Tim," whenever Tim thanked him. One day, Tim thought to shortcut the process and said, "That's your pleasure, Pa." Frank's main pleasures were music, jewellery and gardening. He always loved to show his visitors his garden and advised people how and when to grow their plants. Towards the end of his life, when Frank was staying in Beth Shean, he made friends with a cockatiel which would come and talk to him when he went out in the garden. Rob remembers sitting in the still of night near a creek that reflected the stars from its glassy surface. When he looks up to the stars, he remembers his dad. Rob remembers a tireless Frank in the hot weather taking the kids to Galston Pool after he came home from work on Saturday afternoon. They would climb into the hot Kingswood and make the drive out there. They didn't go to a closer pool because that was the best pool for Gary. He would peel his burnt skin off the vinyl seats and change into his mustard-coloured board shorts so that he could spend the afternoon tossing the kids around the water. After they made a long, hot drive home, he would pull out the mower and cut the grass. Rob remembers Frank's passion for gemstones. He was an expert on the topic, and the family would go out looking for stones in the freezing weather at some remote, isolated place. Jen remembers these holidays as well, but not quite as fondly as Rob. The family had lots of holidays when they would go out to visit Ruth and Jim McNabb on their farm, when they go down to Melbourne to visit their cousins or go to Mangrove Mountain. There were plenty of family gatherings where all the cousins would get together and enjoy themselves. Frank made up for the long hours he worked and the hours he missed with his own children when he retired. Even though he wasn't really domesticated, he loved his grandchildren and spent as much time with them as he could. Frank was a meek man. These days, people use the word humble, but that doesn't really convey the right sense. While it is true that Frank was a humble man, he was also meek. Frank knew that the Lord had called him to service, and he was willing to trust the Lord to take care of him while he served the Lord. Frank didn't fight hard for his rights. He just went ahead and used his gifts to serve the Lord. Frank began work as an apprentice jeweller with Angus and Coote when he was just 14, in the last years of the Second World War. His father suffered from chronic pain and many other illnesses, and Frank contributed much of his income to support the family during the times when his father was unable to work. He was a gifted artist and expressed this in his work as a jeweller. He chose to work as a manufacturing jeweller because he was unwilling to sell overvalued items of jewellery with his employers. Frank was a talented and well-read man. He once told me that he could hear all the different parts of a choral piece in his head, and then he would write them down for the choir to use. When he retired, Frank loved to read and had an extensive knowledge of a wide variety of topics. I'm reminded of some words from Danny Boy as I think about Frank. The world is a richer, sweeter place because Frank lived among us for 88 years. However, on the 23rd of July, the Lord said to Frank, "You have lived a long life of faithful service. Come on home and stay with me now." In closing, we're going to ask the choir to sing a couple of verses of their signature piece. Thanks, David. And after that, we'll be able to go. Everyone can join in the singing.
Yes, I'm not the choir conductor. In fact, my wife tells me I can only do one thing at a time. Now, to be a conductor, you've got to do many things at a time, and that's few among men, my wife tells me. But I understood this was to be a congregation song. And so it'd be nice if everybody stood up at the appropriate moment. The music will start and we'll get a note to stand up. I'll stand out here and sing as I do, pretty loud and raucously. And you join in, please, even if you don't know it. Thank you. Stand. When the last day shall come, and the roll shall be called, when the saints meet the Saviour in the air, when the pilgrim and stranger at last reach their home, we'll be there, praise the Lord, we'll all be there. We'll be there, we'll be there, we'll be there, on the door of that great, great and glorious day, when the saints will gather home